Greetings everybody. Today we're exploring Yucca Valley in Australia. We're on the hunt for natural, inorganic pigments. We're looking along the shoreline and riverbeds of this creek for some colourful stones that we can turn into paint. For millennia, humans have been mesmerised by the power of colour. Before there was such a thing we call art, colour and pattern was used for magical and religious purposes to demarcate the initiatory passages of human life, such as birth, marriage, death. They use things like carbon, ash, blood, and colourful stones such as these that you can find in riverbeds all around the world. These inorganic pigments are minerals made of iron, manganese, copper, substances that decided what colour they are 1 million years ago, so they're not going to change their mind soon. That makes them excellent in terms of light fastness and archivability. These natural umbers and ochres are the workhorses of traditional oil painting. If we think about artwork that's previous to the 20th century, 90% of the work was done with these cheap, highly available earth pigments. Yellow ochre, raw sienna, raw umber, and their burnt versions, which is when they're cooked without oxygen. So we're looking for stones that are fairly soft, taking out a bit of sandpaper and seeing if the colour comes off easy and retains saturation. Okay, we've moved location down to some cow fields near Mullumbimby, and just want to show you that you don't need to live in a national park near a volcano to find these colourful stones. They're all around the planet, and if you don't live near a river but you're in the mountains or near the sea, you might want to try looking for veins of colourful rock in cliff faces. One thing that we need to emphasize is that you need to be able to crush these stones up. If they're too hard, our paint will be very granular. We need to be able to powder these into a very soft, fine powder in order to end up with very fine paint. This is something you can test on site by just crushing your colourful stones between some harder rocks. So this is looking great. We're going to return to the studio now and show you how we make this into oil paint. Okay, once we get back to the studio, we've crumbled off some of the rock onto the palette, and we're just mixing some cold pressed linseed oil in with our palette knife to see how granular it is, if it mixes into the oil well, and what kind of colour it possesses. It's really important to determine whether our collected rocks are actually suitable for making into paint. They should be soft enough and colourful enough that they crumble well and they show their colour when they're scratched onto sandpaper like this. So now we're breaking it up and adding it to a mortar and pestle, and we're going to pummel it into a fine powder. If the rocks that you collect don't yield, it's probably that your rocks are too hard to make into paint. Right now, we're passing it through a sieve in order to capture any of the rocks that are too hard to break down. Then we add water. We're using the water to grade our pigment. By suspending the pigment in water, the heaviest particles will fall the fastest, and the pond scum, the kind of organic matter, will come to the top like a skin. And in between, usually that's the sweet spot where we can collect our pigment. So add your pigment to water in a jar and give it a good shake. You can ask for one of these syringes at your local pharmacy or chemist. They're really useful for drawing out the middle area of the water, which usually has the pigment that you want. It leaves the heavy, silty stuff at the bottom, and you want to ignore the skin at the top, where usually you get some organic matter floating. Then we pour this liquid into a baking dish and leave it in the sun or in an oven on low temperature to dry it out. You'll end up with a dried riverbed, and you can scratch that off the bottom of the baking dish and put it in a jar and just store it for as long as you like. This is your pigment. Right then, we're going to make oil paint. So we have here some cold pressed linseed oil, and we have the pigment we've made. Now we're going to make this paint on our palette because we're going to paint with it straight away. But you can use a piece of glass or marble. So we'll make a little pile here, and you can see a little indent where we pour our oil because we don't want to make it too wet too quickly. This is a glass muller. The bottom of the muller has been sandblasted to give it a bit of tooth. So you press the oil into the pigment and you go clockwise and then counterclockwise and mix it in. And if it's too dry, add a bit more oil. The longer you go with this process, the smoother and the finer your paint will be mixed. So don't skip on your effort at this point. If you want to tube the paint, you can make it much thicker than this. But if you're planning on painting with it the same day, there's no harm having it fairly wet. If you want to make it thicker, you just keep adding pigment, saturating the oil with more and more pigment. You can get it to a toothpaste-like consistency. So now we're going to test our paint. Using a little bit of cold pressed linseed oil here. And we're going to see how well it flows. Beautiful. It's flowing and we don't have any big particles or clumps. And as with all oil paint, we can control the thickness and the concentration by adding more or less cold pressed linseed oil. It's that simple to make paint. Happy experimenting.